Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Missing Legendary Lords Dwarf Edition. Now, this is a video that will go over the Legendary Lords who are part of the Dwarf army list in Warhammer, who haven't quite made it onto the Total War Warhammer game. Now, I'm drawing most of these lords from the Dwarves 8th edition book, which, for those of you who don't know, was really the last edition of the tabletop game that was released by Games Workshop, and seems to be the basis upon which most of the units and characters used in Total War Warhammer have come from. So I thought that would be a good basis to get into the mind of Creative Assembly and really show you guys sort of maybe what they're looking at as their top options for future Legendary Lords for the Dwarf armies. So let's kick things off, shall we? First we have up is Thorek Ironbrow. Now, Thorek is the best living runesmith and smithy, really, in general, that the dwarves have left. He's almost as good as the ancient smiths of old. Now, don't be thrown by the name. I know that in the Belagar and his new faction, the Angrid clan, that there is a Throny Ironbrow as well, one of the ghost ancestors. I don't think that's meant to be the same person. I couldn't tell if they were related, Throny and Thorek. But they are, as far as I can see, completely different people. Now, Thorek should be armed with an Anvil of Doom. Now, those sorts of generals are already in the game, and it's weird that they didn't introduce Thorek when those types of generals came out. But maybe they're just saving him for a slightly later time. He is essentially a rune lord, but an upgraded one, if you will. Now, the thing about sort of some of his personality traits is he's very old-fashioned, very sort of stubborn, dwarf-wise, and he doesn't like any of these sort of newfangled technologies. So I think if you were to introduce him to a Total War Warhammer game, you might want to give him sort of penalties against having some of the newer dwarf technologies that haven't been tested over centuries, if not millennia, that he would approve of if they had been, such as the gyrocopters or indeed the organ gun, stuff like that. The newer tech that that Thorgrim himself has championed the use of, Thorek would be very much against. He'd be like, no, let's stick to the bolt thrower and the catapults. That's all we need. We don't need any of this newfangled nonsense. Thank you very much. Not for me. So maybe give him an upkeep, not bonus, but penalty to those newer technologies. But maybe give him a boost to some of his runic abilities and the way he can handle bolt throwers and maybe the older tech that the dwarves have. Now, Thorek himself is also very keen on reclaiming the lost Dwarven holds. He very much agrees with Thorgrim in this goal and this ambition, and he's very much happy to work with Thorgrim to help him achieve that. Thorek's based out of Karak-Azul is where he tends to make his home, and although I said he's keen on reclaiming the Dwarven holds, a more keen focus for him is actually reclaiming the lost treasures, so the lost runic weapons of these holds and rediscovering them and learning how they're done, and really just trying to expand his knowledge of runes and carving runes and smithing in general to try and recreate the lost technologies, if you will, of their dwarven ancestors and try and bring back their power and the power of the old weapons they used to be able to forge. On the whole, that's really all I can really dig up on Thorek. There's not a lot more I know about him, unfortunately. But yeah, he would be essentially an upgraded Anvil Lord who I think should have a penalty against some of the newer tech like gyrocopters, but maybe a bonus for some of the older technologies like bolt throwers and things of that nature. I think he would be quite a cool character. His gear is his anvil hammer, which you can see quite clearly on the picture on the right. It's an anvil-shaped hammer, which he uses upon an anvil. I'm sure there's some metaphor in there somewhere, but that's escaping me at the moment. And his runic forged armor, which has been said to be able to turn away the blows of giants. So that should be quite an impressive armor. I think he's probably more of a hardy character who can probably take a lot of punishment rather than necessarily an offensive one, like Belagar or Ungrim or Thorgrim even to a certain extent. So I think that's what Thorek should be, just a character who's able just to take a lot of punishment, really. And I think that's about it for Thorgrim. I think he'd be a great addition to the game. I think it'd be great to have a named character who is an Anvil Lord. So very much looking forward to seeing when CA introduce him to the game. And moving on, we have slightly on the other end of the ideological spectrum, we have Grimm Burlaksson. Now, Grimm is the youngest ever dwarf to pass all the rituals to qualify as a master engineer. He is the son of the engineer guild master. He was always sort of destined for great things. But in sort of his later years, people have started to get a bit worried about him, a bit concerned. And that is because he is very much, as opposed to Thorek, who I spoke about previously, he is very much focused on new and in sort of pushing things forward. Not necessarily like fine-tuning them for centuries. He wants to move on to the next best idea, the next great thing. And a couple of his inventions of note are sort of his double-barreled shotgun, which can mow down reams of goblins at a time. And as I said, he is the youngest to have ever qualified as a master engineer. And during his youth, described as a beardling, he came up with a couple of novel inventions that I thought were pretty brilliant. Number one, so this is like him as a kid, I think, a dwarf version of a kid. He invented the self-lighting pipe. And as you can see on the picture on the left, there is the model with the pipe. And I think if they do bring him into the game, I'd love to see him just with his own patented self-lighting pipe in his mouth. I think that'd be great. He also invented the steam-powered beard braider. Must be a huge time saver for the dwarves nowadays. Must be his bestseller. And I think a hilarious invention for a legendary lord to have made. You know, you've got to braid those beards. Why not save time doing it? It's a genius idea all around from Grimm Burlaksson. The reason that, sorry, I mentioned he's looked down upon a little bit now, and it's because he doesn't want to sort of fine tune his inventions. He just wants to move on to the next thing. Now, people are worried that this will lead to some deaths and cause him to be dishonored. His father was very much the same way, but during one of his experiments, he injured a fellow engineering student, and that very much changed his ideology. But they're hoping that it won't take that to change Burlaksson's mind. But at the moment, he's a very impetuous inventor, a very impetuous dwarf, a very impassioned engineer. And one of the other inventions he has is something called a steam gauntlet, and that in itself makes him increases his strength greatly in terms of what he's able to yield as a weapon or wield as a weapon, and how he gets around the battlefield. So I think he should be an engineer who can not only shoot, but actually can hold his own in melee. And there is already the engineer who does that, but he's ethereal in Clan Angrand. But this would be great to have a real-life engineer who can hold his own in one-on-one combat. You'd be confident sending him in, but also having him on the front lines, making full use of that double-barreled shotgun. And I think he's a great-looking model and would add a lot to the engineering class. The another thing to note is the thing on his back is an axe, actually. It's his melee weapon. And those cogs technically spin around and sort of slice and dice and sort of break weapons if they catch them in their gears. It's just a very interesting melee weapon. And I think if Creative Assembly could render that properly and make those gears spin around, I think it'd be a great looking thing to see in the game as well. And I think that's what CA have done so fantastically, is taking these things that are in Warhammer fans' imaginations and rendered them really wonderfully in the game. So moving on to our next potential legendary lord, we have Josef Bugman. Now, I think Josef Bugman is definitely going to appear in the game. He is probably the most famous, if not second most famous, character that Games Workshop, the inventors of the tabletop game, have in their repertoire, second only to maybe the White Dwarf, who's Grombrindal, who they've already released. Now, the story with Josef Bugman is that he is from a clan of dwarves called the Dragonback clan. I think it's Dragonback. Yes, the Dragonback clan. And they used to live in what is now called Ekrund on the Warhammer map. So where the Savage Orcs come out of. The name's escaping me, of the Wurzag. That's it. So if you play a Wurzag campaign, Ekrund's where you start out as Wurzag. Now, it used to be home of a clan called the Dragonback Dwarves. But once the Orcs took it over, they fled, and they fled north into the Grey Mountains. Now, Joseph's father, a chap called Zamil, set them up in the woods just to the eastern part of the empire against the Grey Mountains, but not quite in the mountains, in the woods in that area. Now, it was quite an isolated area, and there he set up his brewing business. And wanting to sell brew recognized very much amongst the dwarves of Bugman's Brew, then he wanted to set up trade links with the Empire and sell them the brew as well to grow the business. And in order to do that, Zamil, rather like some people do when moving to different countries or to different cultures, changed his name to Samuel to make it easier for the Empire folk to understand. And thus he named his son Joseph. If Joseph ever had a more dwarven-y name, it's been lost to the records, lost to time, as it were. But he's ever been known as Josef Bugman. Now, Joseph eventually took over the business when his father died and expanded it greatly. He started selling to the Empire. He had Bugman's Brew. He expanded it to something called Troll Brew, which was a stronger version, I believe. And he made huge trade links with the Empire. And it became renowned as sort of the best ale around. So much so that the Emperor even started ordering some. And on a trip to deliver the brew, a special batch of brew, to the Emperor himself, Bugman left his family, which has now become a small estate of sorts, as they had to keep increasing employees, and the employees brought their families, and they all lived around the brewery. So Bugman goes off on his trip, and upon his return, he sees a pillar of smoke rising up from where he knows the brewery is. And just thinking, it's probably time for the monthly chimney sweep. But as he approached, he found the brewery in flames. Everyone had been slaughtered, his family, his friends, his colleagues. It was a massacre, and it turned out that it was a massacre committed by goblins. And at the time, in Games Workshop lore, the goblin in question was a guy called Git Guzzler, but he's since sort of just fallen out of the frame. I don't know. I doubt CA would reintroduce him. I don't think he's been around since maybe 3rd edition or even 2nd. He just sort of fell out of popularity, and Games Workshop can do this from time to time. They just tend to forget named characters and don't give them a conclusion to their stories at all. But I like to think that at some point Joseph caught up with him, and that was the end of Git Guzzler. But essentially, Joseph, so enraged by this, sort of vowed revenge upon any who threatened dwarven people. And with the few survivors of the brewery, they formed the Josef Bugman's Rangers. And they have wandered the mountains, taking out goblin camps, murdering any greenskins they come across. And they're known to sort of wander out of the mountains from time to time, sort of tattered and war-weary, covered in goblin blood, and just intending to join any army that's looking to assault any major orc or goblin stronghold. They would just appear out of the mountains and just be like, we're here to join you guys, let's go, let's battle these bastards. Now himself, although the Rangers are introduced in the Warhammer, in the Total War Warhammer game already, I was very surprised not to see Joseph himself included. I thought that was a bit of a weird one. But I hope he will be, I'm pretty sure he will be included at some point. Joseph himself is actually a melee fighter. Although the Rangers are missile units, Joseph himself is a melee fighter. He's armed with an axe called Old Trustworthy, which is a rune axe. Now, it has sort of mysterious origins, because people are like, sure, it's an ancient axe of renown, really. They're like, this must be a famous weapon that you wield here, Joseph. But he won't ever reveal the axe's true name. And in his other hand, he's always carrying a tankard of Bugman's ale. Now, CA have been quite good with this. With the Joseph's Bugman's Rangers, as they exist at the moment, there is an ability where they drink the ale and they recover some HP. In the tabletop game, they can either sort of become more tough, or they can set their arrows on fire. The ale's a bit more random in the effects it has, but I think that's a good enough sort of aspect to do sort of a regenerating thing. I think they should add that to Joseph himself, because his literal other weapon is a tankard from his old brewery alehouse. I love the picture on the left there, by the way. I think I hope that's on any future Bugman's Ale's bottles, but I think it sums up his story quite nicely. Bugman's Ale actually has become such a staple of the Warhammer universe that they actually, if you go on a tour of the Games Workshop site, and I believe they're based out of Norwich in the UK, you can actually have a pint of Bugman's Ale, and Troll Brew for that matter. But the real thing to remember here is that Josef Bugman is an iconic Warhammer character. There's no doubt they have to include him at some point. Like, he just has to be in there. And I look forward to playing as him, and I hope he will be a kick-ass lord. And as far as the 8th edition characters go, those are the only ones actually missing as far as the named legendary lords are concerned. Now, I have a couple more to show you, and these ones are slightly more caveated, but I think they will be or should be included, if not as lords, maybe as special heroes of some sort. But the first one up is Gotrek and Felix. Now, these two are a double team from a very well-loved series of novels about the Warhammer fantasy universe. Now, Gotrek is a slayer. Now, I don't know, I may have covered this in one of my previous videos, but essentially slayers are people who have been dishonored in the eyes of Dwarven society, or even in just their own eyes, and have taken the Slayer Oath, which is to go out and die in battle defending the Dwarf kingdoms. Now, as soon as they take the Slayer Oath, as far as their family and friends are concerned, they're dead. They're dead in Dwarven society. They have a ceremony, I think, where they sort of essentially have a funeral, and that's them. As far as their old life is concerned, that's the end of them. So Gotrek, we don't know to this day, I don't believe, what crime he committed or what he did to dishonor his own name. But at some point, Gotrek took the Slayer Oath. And he has since become recognized as the greatest or worst Slayer in Dwarven history. Now, greatest because he kills everything. He's killed demons, he's killed giants, he's killed dragons, vampires, even something called a Black Ark, which is essentially a floating sea fortress, powered by sea monsters. He took that down himself. Like, there's nothing that Gotrek hasn't killed in the Warhammer world, and this worries him because he thinks he won't find an honorable death in battle, and he'd be maybe the first Slayer to die of old age, which would be a huge dishonor. But Gotrek has just become this crazy powerful Dwarven Slayer, and he at one point was going through the Empire, and he encountered this chap called Felix, who was a poet at the time, has some experience in personal hand-to-hand combat. In fact, he got run out of his school because he killed another pupil in a duel, and his family disowned him and threw him out. And essentially, they met because at the time, Felix was participating in a protest over taxation in the capital city of the Empire, Altdorf. And the protest got violent, and they started rioting, essentially, and the Emperor sent in the Reichsguard. And seeing this, and seeing the horror that was about to unfold, Felix bravely launched himself in front of the crowd and stood there, very much sort of like a la Tiananmen Square style protest, like, no, don't, you have to go through me, you'll have to murder me, an unarmed man. if you want to hurt all of these protesters. And they were about to, but Gotrek, for some reason known only to him, maybe he admired the boy's bravery, but leapt in front of him, hacked down a couple of rights guard, and helped Felix escape. And they got just absolutely smashed on alcohol. They were just drank sort of for a day and a night. And by the time Felix sort of came to his senses, in celebration of just surviving that riot, and by the time Felix came to his senses, he had vowed to Gotrek to follow him and write an epic poem about his doom, about the way in which he will eventually die as a slayer. And so he's sort of indebted, well, sort of as sworn an oath to Gotrek to do this. So essentially, he has to follow Gotrek round as Gotrek intentionally gets himself into horrifically dangerous situations, and Felix is just sure he's going to die at any point. But through just the sheer skill of Gotrek, and Felix himself has actually not become a bad hand-to-hand combatant himself over their journeys. These guys just have adventures all over the world as Gotrek tries to get himself into trouble. Felix is pretty sure they're going to die at every turn, but they manage to survive just these incredible odds over and over again. And these two are a much-loved pair, and Games Workshop has shown that they can do a pair of units together with Skarsnik and his Squig. So I think they should do these two as a pair together, a general pair. If not a general pair, then definitely a hero unit that can be selected maybe either by Empire and by Dwarves. They can maybe make it a Regiment of Renowned unit of 2. Now, Gotrek himself is armed with a special axe, and it's thought to be one of a pair of axes. The other one belongs to Thorgrim, the High King of the Dwarves. That used to belong to their ancestor god sorry, voice went there a bit, Grimnir. And so it's a very special axe, and it's said to have it's made Gotrek more than what he used to be. It's made him this super slayer as opposed to just a normal slayer who just happens to be quite skilled at hand-to-hand combat. And it's also said to have extended his life as well as the life of Felix. Now, in their adventures, Felix actually picked up a very nice blade himself called Karagul. Now, they actually got this from the vaults of Karak 8 Peaks. They were in there when it was under Orc and Skaven occupation and went down, and I think he found this, and it's actually a sword designed to be a dragon slayer. So I think maybe if they did introduce him to game, great opportunity to give him maybe a bonus against large, if not a specific bonus against dragons. But it also enrages him. So if he's holding the sword and a dragon actually shows up on the scene, Felix will actually lose his mind and charge towards the dragon because of the sword's influence. And often Gotrek has to probably save his ass literally out of the fire from that one. But they're a great pair. There's a huge amount of lore around them. I'm not going to get into all of it today. But I'd say if you want a sort of a nice introduction to different aspects of Warhammer universe, maybe pick up one of their books. I think they have made a great impression over the years. But they did actually used to be a unit. You'll see their model there in the picture above in the top right. But they haven't been a unit available since 6th edition. But I think because they're such a well-known pair, CA will probably eventually introduce them. Now, the last one is a guy I have mentioned before. If you haven't seen my actual missing units from Total War Warhammer, do check out that video. I'll put a link at the end of this one. But Malakai Makaisson was an engineer who worked on a ship which the dwarves called an ironclad, much like the ironclads that existed in the real world. He worked on one called the Unsinkable. It promptly sank. He worked on an airship called the Indestructible. It was promptly destroyed. It blew up in an accident, killing all dwarves. And in shame, he was an engineer who ended up taking the Slayer Oath. And he didn't stop inventing just because he became a Slayer. He kept inventing and eventually worked on an airship that the previously mentioned Gotrek and Felix ended up going on an adventure with. But he also invented a couple of cool other things. So firstly, it would be great to see airships in the game. And he invented something called the Axe Hewer, or the Goblin Hewer, which is essentially a machine that lobs axes over and over again, like just a non-stop stream of axes at its enemies. Now, I'd love to see those units in the game, but I think you can't introduce those units without introducing Malakai himself. And I think it'd be very cool to have a colorful Slayer Engineer as a legendary lord in the game. So yeah, and I think that really sums it up. I think that's about it for the 8th edition. A couple of exceptions I put in there who are colorful personalities. But I hope this was informative and gives you guys an idea of what we might be able to look forward to with the Dwarven Lords in the future. And I can't wait for them all to be introduced. And there are others in earlier editions, but seeming like going on what CA have done so far and what they focused on, this looks like it will probably be what they're looking at in terms of introducing future legendary lords. And as I say, there are legendary lords there they haven't introduced. So there's an engineering legendary lord they haven't introduced, and an anvil legendary lord they haven't introduced yet either. So I think they fit in quite nicely with the game as it stands at the moment, and would be fairly easy to do. I think they're just having to cover the modeling for them there at this point. But as I said, hope that was helpful. Guys, please do subscribe. This is my first of a series. I will probably cover all the different factions of Total War Warhammer as it stands currently. I think my next might be Empire, but don't hold me to that. And hopefully you'll join me on that one. Please do subscribe. I'll leave a link for a couple of the other videos at the end of this one, and hopefully you'll enjoy those as well. Thanks very much for watching.